Time is just gone 19 minutes past 9 a.m. We continue with news and views this morning. If you have just joined us, we welcome you to the show. We're also in the company of our One Nation 88.9 FM listeners out of Polokwane this morning and our Salam Media listeners and viewers on the various platforms. You can listen to us, you can view us on the YouTube channel of Salam Media, also on Facebook, and also on all the other platforms that we are able to reach you. And continuing this morning, we are taking a look today, being the 15th of September, the International Day of Democracy, and highlighting and unpacking International Day of Democracy with me this morning is Zaakirah Vadi, campaign manager for Defend Our Democracy. Zaakirah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome.
Walaikum assalam. Jazakallah for having me on your show.
Yes, Zakira, globally, the entire world talks about democracy, and we look at many countries across the world, whether we're looking at America, we're looking at Western Europe, North America, right across the entire world, even a country like India, where it claims to be the world's largest democracy. That on paper, it all sounds good, but in reality, there is definitely something very different that is playing out on the ground.
Definitely. I think we need to differentiate between the concept of democracy and how democracy is practiced in particular countries. Um, in terms of democracy, its functions, I think it does have significant benefits to people in terms of freedoms, freedom of religion, freedom of the media. In fact, today, the 15th of September, is marked as International Day of Democracy. And one of the themes for today is around media freedom. So I think there are significant benefits to democracy, but the way in which it is practiced in particular countries is often questionable. And we have many examples of that. For example, you have in Israel claiming to be a democracy, whereas we know that Israel, many people around the world would consider it an occupying force. Similarly, in India at the moment, you see the kind of tensions playing out, divisions over religious beliefs and how that plays out on the ground. And similarly, we've seen other democracies around the world being tried and tested. In the U.S., when a number of protesters stormed the U.S. Capitol. In Brazil, at the moment, we're seeing a tendency towards right-wing politics. And Sweden, for example, now that many people have voted in a right-wing political party. And I think South Africa is not very different in terms of the global trends in the way in which our democracy has been tried and tested. We've just come out of a period of state capture and corruption. And we see that this period hasn't necessarily ended. We've had COVID-19 corruption. And on a day to day basis, we see how this is continuing. We've seen destabilization in our own country as well. So I think that democracy is being tried and tested throughout the world.
Yes, and also, Zakira, you mentioned this year's theme is press freedom. And when we look at journalism and media right across the entire world, just how, free is the press in a democracy? Because it raises many questions. You mentioned Palestine. We know the killing of Shirin Abu Akli. We've seen many journalists killed. In fact, I had an interview earlier on with somebody out of India, and he was talking about certain Muslim journalists that were jailed in India. And at the same time, we have the big media moguls right across the entire world. And they not free because that we're talking about embedded journalism, pursuing a certain agenda, governments. So, when one puts all of this into perspective and put it into context, what media freedoms are we talking about in a democracy?
So I think let's start off with South Africa. Post 1994, we have seen to a large degree media freedom in our country. Over time, I think there may have been questions in terms of how this is played out. You have, for example, particular politicians attacking people within the media. Social media has certainly played a role where you see journalists coming under attack, abused in the most vile kinds of ways. And more recently in our country, for example, you see the case of Karen Moon, where charges have been laid against her by former President Jacob Zuma. And there, one is the kind of legal related merits of the case, which is a different story. But just in terms of perception, what does it say when you begin to lay charges against a journalist? Does it open the door for everyone now to begin laying charges against journalists or anyone within the activism space that speaks out about something or the other? So I think there are particular trends and perceptions associated with it as well. Similarly, we've seen over the years in our country now, for instance, a political party wants to march on a particular media house because they've reported about a particular figure in a traditional leader and a political leader in a particular way. Over time in our country, we've seen similar tendencies playing out. And across the world, I think we see this assassinations of journalists, journalists being threatened in ways. And it is something that is of great concern. It's something that we need to, at all times, I think, guard against and speak out against.
Yes, and also Zakira, just looking at us here in South Africa, and we claim to be a democracy. We claim to be a constitutional democracy, and apart from just looking at journalism in more ways than one, when one looks at the government, when one looks at the ruling party, and also I think uh, looking at all the challenges that this country is actually faced with in more ways than one. And we find that over and over again, whether it's between political parties, whether it's civil society, whether it is human rights organizations, and we're all now resorting to the courts in the interest of justice, but more importantly, to defend this democracy that we boast about.
Yeah, so I think one is that the courts have, in many ways in our countries, withstood um, a range of things stemming from the last couple of years around issues of capture and corruption. But even more recently, I think the courts have displayed a great degree of impartiality, a great degree of independence. It's not something that's a given. It's something that needs to be checked at all times to ensure that they remain that way. Um, and I think the further we go on this path, you're going to see, for example, following the state capture reports, many people beginning to challenge that report, question it, take particular findings through the courts. And I think it's something that we would have to look out for in the coming years. However, I do want to say something about the current state of our democracy. In 2021, the Afrobarometer put out a report saying that the majority of people in this country would would prefer or would be okay with having some sort of their democratic freedoms taken away, for example, an election and other freedoms, so that they could get or in favor of some sort of socioeconomic support or some sort of socioeconomic stability. And that means basically that people would be okay with some sort of a dictator or beneficial dictator in the country if they guaranteed some sort of socioeconomic stability in the country. And I think that this is very concerning. It is alarming, both in terms of the direction, the poverty rates in the country, but at the same time in the way people value democracy in this country. And the second point that I want to make is that on a day to day basis, we see how democracy in our country is being tried. And this is not only the kind of destabilization like riots or service delivery protests that we may be seeing, but it's issues of xenophobia, for example, where there's no clear political direction coming through from the ruling parties and perhaps other political parties as well. And we see this, for example, in the kind of taxi wars that are going on. People have been speaking about illegal mining, the so-called zamazamas, and the violence that's playing out. And one begins to question: is there a center that's holding in the country? And if it's not holding, is this why we are seeing everything that's going on in terms of rising levels of violence and just a sense of chaos on a day-to-day basis? And this, I think, should be a worry for all who live in this country. That if the center doesn't hold at a political level, what can citizens begin to do to ensure that there's some sort of stability that's pinned down through civic activism at the very least?
Exactly. And also, not forgetting, Zakira, what is playing out as far as the ruling party and the government and the president of the country is concerned. And we know the major talking point has been the Pala Pala scandal. And again, when one ties all of this into what we boast as a democracy, again, many, many questions are being raised. Now, just looking at your position, campaign manager, defend our democracy. What should we be thinking about in defense of our democracy?
So I think there's a few simple things that we need to be thinking about. One for us at the moment is the issue of electoral reform. So, come the 2024 elections, the Constitutional Court has said that there needs to be independent candidates that can participate at a national and provincial level. At this point in time, Parliament is deliberating on how this can be done. We, however, feel that the current bill that Parliament is putting forward is flawed. It doesn't allow for independent candidates to participate at the level that they should be participating. It does disadvantage them. And also, whatever decisions are being taken, we feel is not being done in the interest of the public, but is rather being done in the interest of political parties themselves. So that's the one area of work, and we would urge everyone. It's quite complex, but to just understand how electoral systems work and how by voting more directly for your particular candidate, even at a national and provincial government level, can ensure better accountability by citizens. So that's the one area of work. And over the next couple of weeks, we'll be rolling out a series of workshops that people can attend to get a better understanding of this. This is important because it does put into question the 2024 elections and whether it will run smoothly, whether the Constitutional Court may have differing views about it. So I think it's going to be an important moment for the country. Secondly, on the 15th of October, the President is expected to give feedback on the Zondo Commission recommendations. We feel that there's a need from society to monitor the implementation of those recommendations and to see that government sticks to it and doesn't just sort of whitewash the process. Thirdly, we think it's important for people to develop civic activism wherever they are. So, in your community, there's nothing stopping you from forming a group of people, monitoring, for instance, if your local council budget is being kept to, monitoring if your police station and your CPF are performing, monitoring if monies allocated for a local hospital are being spent correctly. And there are organizations that are doing this kind of work that can provide the kind of training that's necessary. If there are people interested in this, people can look up our details online and get in touch with us, and we can put you in touch with the relevant organizations. So I think that that's going to be important going forward. But most of all, I think that citizens, people living in this country, even if you are not a citizen, need to be vigilant, need to be constantly aware of the political space and understand what are the dynamics at play.
Well, certainly. And also, I think if you look at the role of media in promoting what you are saying, Zakira.
Definitely. I mean, the media has played a significant role over the years in guarding against state capture. We've seen the number of exposés around all sorts of things. Recently, for instance, you've had details coming about the type of information that Babita Diokar and the whistleblower in Gauteng had. And that's really because of the digging work that media people have been doing to uncover what has been behind her killing. And I think that we must celebrate the sort of linkages that the media has formed with activists. For instance, in the KZN area in particular, we've seen how groups like Abahlali, their activists have been targeted on so often. There've been so many killings over the last few years, and we've seen that how those linkages between media people and activists there and activists throughout the country are being strengthened on a day-to-day basis. And I think that this is important for the lifeblood of our democracy. Secondly, I think we must commend the many media people that have withstood great pressures, be it on social media, be it in their day to day workings. It's not always an easy environment to be working. So I think we commend the media people who have really ensured that they play the role of watchdog over this democracy.
Well, we are talking with Abashlali, in fact, at around 9:50 this morning. Interesting that you mentioned that. But Zakira, Jazakallah as always for your time, and we wish you well. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Jazakallah, assalamu alaikum.
Zaakirah Vadi joining us this morning, campaign manager for Defend Our Democracy. A quick break. We'll come back. We'll be joined by political analyst Dr. Insikelelo Breakfast.